In 1827, the botanist Robert Brown put a piece of pollen into some water, and he put it under a microscope, and he noticed that the pollen was moving. There was no external force on the water or the pollen or anything, and it was moving. And it wasn't just jiggling around, and it wasn't just rotating or something. It was like tracing this path through the water. And they tried to map it and understand why it was moving like this. But to them, it appeared to be completely random. About 100 years later, about Albert Einstein, he said that you could explain the movement of the pollen in the water if you modeled the water not as this homogeneous mass liquid thing, but actually millions or whatever particles that are all bouncing around. And as they bounced around, they would hit against the pollen, and the pollen would be bumped in a certain direction, and then a different direction, and then a different direction. To him, it was not random. Okay? Like even today, with today's scientific, power that we have, we still can't predict where Brownian motion is going to send that piece of pollen. But we can at least understand what's causing it. We understand that it's not random. What appears to be random might not be random. It might just be complex or even unknowable to our human senses. So in science, we abstract complex things with models. We build models that are a simplification of the real thing. And in tabletop role-playing games, we kind of do the same thing, except we don't call them models, we call them mechanics. If a player attempts an action for which the variables are known with a high degree of confidence, at least, we don't have a mechanic for it. The player just says what they want to do, and the outcome is described. But if the factors are complex enough that or that we just don't have access to that information, then we abstract that situation with something like a die roll, because in as far as our experience of that event is concerned, it is at least partly random. So the human brain has kind of a limit of how complex a system it can focus on and understand at one time. So we make these models so that we can basically bring the world underneath our cognitive threshold. We add mechanics to simplify the reality, to simplify the world and the way it works. You'll notice that as we add mechanics, we might make the world simpler, but we make the game more complex. And ultimately, if you add enough mechanics to a game, then you will get to the point where you cross the threshold again, and adding mechanics has become self-defeating. So you want balance, a balance to keep things under the threshold, but to make sure that the world that you're trying to represent is simple enough. So let's take a look at the two extremes of mechanical complexity in RPGs. Imagine a game with no mechanics. It'd just be an interplayer interface between player agency and GM FIAT. It might be the designer's intent to alleviate some of the pressure on GMs by adding mechanics to the game, because for each mechanic you add, you take away a little of the responsibility that the GM has to come up with a way to deal with that problem. No matter what the intent is, though, for every mechanic you add, you take away a little GM FIAT. The game designers are exerting control over how the GM is adjudicating things, really. And I guess that's because they think that they have worked out the best way to adjudicate that particular thing. So removing the GM in this way kind of shows a lack of trust in the GM. If you've heard a review for a rules light RPG, you might notice that sometimes they say, you might need an experienced GM to run it. And I suppose by adding mechanics to show the GM how to adjudicate these things, it's like they're showing inexperienced GMs the ropes. Or maybe they know that there are GMs out there who are somewhat sadistic and who enjoy to antagonize their players, or even worse, they enjoy to antagonize one particular player. And if they have mechanics that govern the issues that come up, then they've taken the power of the GM to do that away from them, and they've made it a rule so that the players have, they know how it's meant to be adjudicated, and they can't be victimized by a GM that does that. If someone in particular came to mind when I said that, it might mean that the problem is, ubiquitous enough that designers do know that this is an issue. And if they want to kind of control the player experience, if they want the player's experience to be a positive one, then they can make rules in the game that tell the GM how to do everything, how to put every enemy into every encounter, and how much gold to give them, and how much experience to give out, and the challenge ratings and all that stuff. In Republic, Plato, he says that the indiscipline of a society can be measured by the weight of its legal system. I'll just leave it at that. In fact, if you add enough mechanics, taking away GM fiat, you can add enough mechanics that you don't need a GM at all. At the point you've removed all of GM fiat, if everything a player can do is governed by mechanics, then you're playing a war game. So in a war game or a board game, if there's not a mechanic for something that a player can do, you can't do it. It's against the rules. This slims down player agency to a very select few options. The designers of the game, they want to make the game fair, so they limit what you can do to a set of options that they have carefully controlled and selected. In an RPG, when you roll initiative, you start one of these war games where everything is controlled and very fair, and the goal of the player characters is to defeat the enemy NPCs, and the goal of the games master is to thrash the players within an inch of their life. Players load their characters with tactical upgrades and powers and gear, and they pour over their character sheet for mechanical ways to win. And the GM does the same thing with the monster stat blocks. So when a game has extensive combat rules, it's because the game designers want you to have a fair, tactical, competitive combat experience. All these concerns kind of evaporate when the players and the GM are on the same page about what the goal is for the game. If the goal of a role-playing game is for the player to inhabit a character, to live as that character and to act as that character and make decisions for that character, then there is no competition. The point of combat then is no longer to win, it's to discover something about those characters. The GM and the players want to see who those characters are under those circumstances, because when you put a character into conflict, you learn things about them that you could not have under other circumstances. So something like you learn who you truly are through hardship. It's the true man is revealed in difficult times, right? If the GM's goal is to see the characters become who they are, then there's no competition. You see, the role play is the goal of both the GM and the players. There's still conflict and adversity and combat and whatever, but the GM and the players' goals are the same. As a GM, when you put your players into combat or conflict, it should be because you want to learn something about those characters, to see a part of them that you could not have seen in any other circumstance. It's to give an opportunity to the players to express who that character is in a way that you can't without that sort of conflict. If the GM's and the players' goals are the same, then you don't need a book full of mechanics to mediate the competition between them. You don't need to prevent rule abuse and make things fair. And if the players trust their GM, then you don't need mechanics that abstract power away from GM fiat, because then they're not worried that the GM's going to try and pull some gotcha or lord their GMly power over the players. If the GM throws something horrible in front of the players, something catastrophic, the players should be cheering because it's an opportunity for them to learn something about their character, about how that character responds in that situation. If it kills them, right? Great. And player death is a wonderful opportunity for them to role play that out and see what their character's like in that situation, and to see kind of from afar the aftermath of that event. And through adversity and failure and death and conflict and triumph and overcoming, one thing has stayed consistent, and that is role play. And if that's if that's been the goal the whole time, and that's what you've done, and then you've succeeded. You've succeeded about the one thing the game is actually about: role play. I get kind of fired up about this because I know that RPGs have so much potential as like an art form outside of just being a board game. After all, that it is to say that if you're going to have mechanics in your game, make sure they facilitate roleplay. And if you're a GM or a player, make sure that roleplay is what you are there to do. If you do that, then the designers of the game don't have to invent a bunch of mechanics to solve a problem that never should have been there in the first place. Anyway, no doubt in a video that's this long, I could not approach all of the issues here with any nuance, and there are most likely many edge cases where what I've said is incorrect. So I want to hear about them. You can drop those in the comments below. Until next time, my name is Matt. This was The Tomb of Lime. Thank you very much for listening.